Well, it really is a pleasure to be back here in Leeds. So I did my undergraduate degree in the School of History, and then came back to do an MA under Ed Spears and Hugh Cecil. I had a fantastic time. I must say, one of the disappointments in my life is that when I came up here a few years ago for an applicant visitors day with my daughter, she decided not to come here and you went somewhere else instead. So never mind, anyway. But it's a really great pleasure. And thanks very much for Chris and for Jessica for inviting me up. Okay, well, John Terraine. I've been interested in John Terraine for a very long time. In fact, I can almost exactly remember, well, I can remember exactly the moment I became interested in him, although I can't pin down an exact date. I suspect it was sometime in 1980 or 81 in my garret bedroom in a hovel on Clarendon Road when I was an undergraduate here. I was doing an essay which was entitled, well, the question was Haig a donkey? And after I sort of worked out exactly, I wasn't being asked literally about animals with four legs, I was reading one of John Terraine's books, in fact his biography of Haig, Douglas Haig, the Educated Soldier, and I came across this phrase, the victory won by Haig's army on the Somme in 1916. That made me stop and sit up and pay attention. I really couldn't work out how he could possibly come up with that particular phrase. Later, as I undertook an academic career, I engaged with his ideas, and I certainly don't agree with everything he wrote, and I think I've moved beyond his work in some respects. He remains hugely influential on my thinking, and that of other historians. And in fact, in writing my recent bio of Haig, the chief, John Terraine's Douglas Haig, the Educated Soldier, was, if you like, the gold standard I had in mind. I should actually say what I'm going to talk about this evening is a work in progress. I first wrote something on him about 8 years ago, and I did a sort of short essay, a bit longer than an obituary, for his for the Royal United Services Institute Journal just after his death. And I followed it up with an entry for the new Oxford DNB. And I'm actually going to be drawing on this material, but I've added to this because through the kindness of his partner, Cathy Stevenson, I've been given, as so far, exclusive access to John Terraine's working papers and correspondence. It's absolute treasure trove. And I've really just scraped the surface, and one of my projects for next year is to go back and really sort of dive very deeply into them. It's full of not only gems such as information about his working practices, but he had a very widespread correspondence in the 50s, 60s, in fact through to the 80s, particularly with Great War veterans. And it's been a real privilege to come across little gems in the archive which shed light on particular events. Anyway, this is going to be developed into a full-scale article, hopefully to be finished next year. Well, John Alfred Terraine was born in London in 1921. He therefore grew up in that period when Britain was struggling to come to terms with the shock of the First World War. His father was badly wounded in that war, and he died when John was only 6, and John always regarded him as a victim of the war. And contrary to popular myth, the entire country was not swept up in a wave of pacifism in the interwar period. Alongside the idea that the war had been a futile waste, there was another strand of thinking, a patriotic view of the war. In extreme form, this gave birth to The Crown of Honour, being stories of heroism, gallantry and devotion from the Great War of 1914-18, a book that John Terraine was awarded as a school prize in 1933. Unfortunately, Terraine was to write much later, the act of sweeping away this sort of rubbish led to the opposite extravagances, the disenchanted, lions led by donkeys school of thought. Weaned on such soft diet as the Crown of Honour, Terraine continued, then appetised afresh by the sharper flavoured victuals of the disenchanted, I spent a long time with myths. By the late 1950s, Terraine had come to believe that if the First World War was to be understood, myths no matter how seemingly authoritative, had to be swept aside. And indeed, he was to devote his career as a historian to attacking myths of various sorts. Terraine argued that the conditions on the Western Front meant that there were no shortcuts to victory. The indirect approach, advocated by the likes of Churchill, was not a solution. In France and Flanders, industrialised warfare, the toughness of the German army, and the lack of flanks to turn made an attritional strategy inevitable. The British army laboured under a number of handicaps, so he argued. They were the junior partners in a coalition dominated by the French. The army of 1914 was, by continental standards, small and focused on colonial warfare, and ill-equipped for the battles to come. Terraine's words, the British army, from commander-in-chief to drummer boy, had to be formed and trained in the field in the face of a powerful, skillful, well-equipped and determined enemy. It was asking a lot. And yet, Terraine argued, in 1918 this army took the lead in defeating the Germans under the command of Field Marshal Sir Douglas Haig. Terraine argued that the victories of the so-called 100 Days could not be separated from the attritional campaigns of 1916 to 17 that wore down the German army and made victory possible. For Terraine, there is no doubt about Haig's status as a great captain. Well, Terraine's ideas on the First World War first appeared in print in the late 1950s, a series of articles eventually published as a book, The Western Front, in 1964. His first original book, Mons, Retreat to Victory, was published in 1960. And in many ways, this was an old-fashioned piece of operational military history. Well-written, generally dependable, solidly based on official histories and published memoirs and diaries. As it appeared just a few years earlier, would have been unlikely to have excited much attention. But it appeared at what Terraine described as the beginning of probably the most disrespectful decade in British history. And indeed, the late 1950s and 1960s were a period of social change, of the questioning of traditional values and mores, and they saw the appearance of a series of books such as Leon Wolf's In Flanders Fields, Alan Clark's The Donkeys, as well as the musical play and later film, Oh What a Lovely War. These presented the First World War as futile and the generalship as disastrous. Well, actually, while they said little that had not already been said in the 1930s, these arguments were presented to a new audience. Well, such books, damningly described by Terraine as instant history, did not have it all their own way. Cyril Fall's The First World War, a well-balanced and accessible book written by a distinguished military historian and indeed veteran of the war, appeared in 1960. But Fall's moderation and good sense did not have the same impact as the shriller tones of Clark and the others. Neither was Cyril Falls, who was fairly aged by that stage, prepared to enter the lists. John Terraine, by contrast, emerged as the principal enemy of the instant historians. He felt deep anger at books he did not hesitate to denounce as rubbish, mercilessly pointing out their factual errors, dubious interpretations, and suspect sources. Described as early as 1962 by Alan Clark as the official custodian of Haig's reputation, continued to confront and correct those with whom he disagreed for over 30 years into the 1990s. Well, Terraine's decision to take on the instant historians on their own ground, in popular and widely read books, in newspaper articles and letters, and in television scripts, rather than the obscurity of academic journals or university seminars like this one, was of very great significance. Now, he was by no means the only popular historian of the 1960s to take a revisionist line on the Western Front. His great friend and admirer Corelli Barnett, Bill Barnett, did so too. But Terraine was the most important and ensured those who visited bookshops or public libraries, if you can remember public libraries, had access to books that took a very different line from those of A.J.P. Taylor or Alan Clark. Well, one thing that struck me while working in his papers is that I had not appreciated the sheer volume of journalism that Terraine carried out. So it's not just through his books and his articles in journals that his views appeared. He also reviewed a large number of books in the national press. Terraine's piece on the donkeys was described as one of the rudest reviews in history, and they weren't wrong about that. His review of John Williams' 1962 book on the 1917 French mutinies is wonderfully dismissive, consisting of a discourse on the mutinies followed by a mere 2 sentences that discuss the book under review. A brisk journalistic essay which leaves no harpy unpainted, includes no evidence that is not telltale. Perhaps one day soon a historian will tackle the theme. Ouch. Terraine also frequently wrote letters to attack comments about the Great War with which he disagreed. So we find him, for example, correcting a newspaper article about, of all things, traffic congestion in northern France, that erroneously referred to Cambrai as the location of the first ever use of tanks. Well, for some, Terraine's line of argument was simply outrageous. Just like Douglas Haig, John Terraine was capable of provoking anger and unreason. As late as 1991, so over 30 years after his views first entered the public sphere, one of his readers wrote to Terraine asking, "Why do you persist in defending the indefensible? I'm genuinely puzzled at your attitude to Haig." And in the 60s and 70s, it was open season on him. Surprisingly common line of attack was that Terraine was too young to have served in the Great War. It was outrageous that he should dare to write about it. A self-evidently stupid argument that undermines the entire rationale of history. That basis, we wouldn't have very many evil historians around. Benny Green, a jazz musician and broadcaster who I remember as making childhood Sunday lunchtimes particularly tedious, but whose credentials for pontificating on military history are not readily apparent, wrote in The Spectator in 1976 that he disagreed with the Terraine ideology. Interesting choice of words. But it is an extremely awkward argument to circumvent. Reviewing a rather unreliable war memoir, Eric Hiscock's The Bells of Hell Go Ting-a-ling-a-ling, Green wrote, "It is a positive relief to be able to hold on to a few facts that not even a Terraine can throw out of court." However, these facts revolved around the lions led by donkeys version in its purest form. Not surprisingly, Terraine filed this review in his myths folder. He also found himself attacked by some veterans of the Great War for his interpretations. In reply, Terraine was polite but unyielding. To one who claimed that, in common with most other men who fought in that war, that Allied strategy should have been purely defensive, Terraine suggested that his correspondent was being rather too British, and if the German army had been standing at Canterbury for 4.5 years, with the whole of southeastern England in its grip, he might have had a different view. Moreover, he said, "I do hope that nothing in my book, The Western Front, suggests that I believe that Haig or any other single man won the First World War. Such a notion is manifestly absurd." As we'll see a little later, there was a smaller but highly appreciative audience of people, including some great war veterans, who took a rather different view of his work. Well, Terraine's reception by the military history establishment was mixed. Although not an academic, doubtlessly one of the most influential military historians of the 60s and 50s and 60s was Basil Liddell Hart. Well, Liddell Hart, of course, had spent brief but traumatic periods on the Western Front as an infantry subaltern. His initial credulous adulation of British generals had, by the 1930s, turned into disillusion, and he emerged as one of the most foremost critics of British high command in the First World War. A clash between the two men was probably foreordained. Well, as a schoolboy, Terraine had been inspired by Liddell Hart's writings, but their exchanges on Passchendaele in the pages of the RUSI journal in the late 50s caused trench lines to be dug. And interestingly, it seems that one of the problems between them seems to have been a simple misunderstanding. There's a letter in the archives from Liddell Hart to Terraine saying that he'd enjoyed Terraine's visit to States House at Medmenham near Marlow in Buckinghamshire, and he was looking forward to Terraine coming back again. And Terraine said, no, well, I've enjoyed coming, but actually I'm not coming back again, you misunderstood me. And it was an increasingly acrimonious exchange of letters. Reading between the lines, John Terraine didn't drive. Even today, getting from West London, where he lived, out to deepest rural Buckinghamshire by public transport is a bit of a trial. And I suspect that Terraine, having gone there once and had to put up with Little Heart being, I suspect, not terribly self-effacing, couldn't face the prospect of another trip. But on such minor things do disputes break out. That, of course, added to the fact that I think Little Heart fundamentally disagreed with Terraine's theses anyway. Well, not surprisingly, Little Heart was vehemently opposed to Terraine's biography of Haig. And in 1963, when the book came out, he organised a behind-the-scenes campaign to attack the book, apparently telephoning and writing to at least 8 individuals to egg them on. One of them obligingly then passed an extract from such a letter straight to John Terraine. Also, the actor George Sewell, the actor who played Haig in the original stage version of Oh, What a Lovely War, rather gave the game away in a review of Terraine's book on Haig. Wonder why they would give an actor that book to review anyway, by saying something along the lines of, "I'm indebted to Captain Little Heart for giving me some ammunition for which to attack this book." So, got into public domain. To be fair to George Sewell, he later repented of his views, joined the Western Front Association, and apologised to John Terraine. This is all about 15 or 20 years later. Well, Little Heart and Terraine worked together on the landmark BBC television series The Great War, which appeared in 1964. But in that year, Little Heart resigned from the series in the most public way possible through an open letter to the Times, and he cited clashes with Terraine over the key episode on the Battle of the Somme as being the trigger. Ironically, Little Heart needs to worry because there is a distinctly revisionist flavour of the script. Actually bends over backwards in Haig's favour, I think, rather much. He's rather too kind to Haig. The script written by Terraine, of course. But actually, the script had little impact on the viewing public, who were simply overwhelmed by the horrific scenes which appeared on the screen. Interesting about, people basically just didn't listen to the script. They actually just watched the pictures. John Keegan, another very prominent commentator who can be compared to Little Heart in some ways, also crossed swords with Terraine. Keegan's review of To Win a War, Terraine's book on 1918, was published under the heading of Whole Stunt Napoo. Good bit of Tommy slang. And it's one that Terraine found deeply hurtful. So I must say, reading it today, it's actually quite funny. Keegan parodied Terraine as the archetypal Tommy. Here he comes now, swinging down the duckboards, tin hat slung, camp comforter over his ears. Keegan recognised the personal cost of Terraine's crusade. There is emotion in the voice. There are wound stripes on the cuff. The old warrior has suffered for his loyalties. Keegan perceptively identified Terraine as the Enoch Powell of British military historians. Like Powell, Terraine stuck year in, year out, doggedly to what he believed to be true, despite the unfashionability of his cause and the hostility he aroused. It's testimony to the strong feelings the First World War could still arouse in that interwar generation that Keegan, who is born about 10 years after Terraine, Keegan's language referred, for instance, to the British generals as being hideously unattractive, men whose diaries reveal hearts as flint-like as the texture of their faces. And indeed, some of Keegan's later writings reveal a response that is no less emotional than Terraine's, but in the opposite direction. Well, as a very junior lecturer at Sandhurst in the 1980s, I can remember a much more senior historian who's still around dismissively saying to me that Terraine was not an academic. Freudian slip there. Given such hostility from parts of the military history establishment, it's not surprising that Terraine developed a somewhat jaundiced view of the academy. In reviewing, actually very favourably, a book on the American Civil War, Terraine responds to the author's comment that within academic circles there had been debate over whether the great Civil War questions were now exhausted by saying, "This is just the sort of thing academic historians do debate about. We must not grudge them their simple pleasures. Terraine was essentially an outsider, and never part of the University Imperial War Museum Sandhurst-based military history establishment of the time, though he was very proud of his honorary fellowship of his alma mater, Keble College, Oxford, and also his election to a fellowship of the Royal Historical Society. His long association with the Royal United Services Institute was in some ways a substitute. He was a council member from 1976 to 1984. In 1982, Terraine was awarded the coveted Chesney Gold Medal. Well, in fact, from very early on, some academics had been prepared to take Terraine's work seriously. Michael Howard and perhaps surprisingly A.J.P. Taylor both gave Douglas Haig the Educated Soldier favourable reviews. In 1963, there was debate in the pages of History Today with a young lecturer in military history, Brian Bond, who over the years grew to admire Terraine's work. And in fact, in his 2000 Lees Knowles lectures, Brian gives a sympathetic and positive assessment of Terraine's work while criticising his limitations and blind spots. Another contemporary of Brian Bond's, my good friend and actually mentor, Professor Peter Simpkins, also readily acknowledges Terraine's importance. But Terraine's influence, I think, was most marked on a younger generation of historians. Sometimes his influence was negative, at least in part. The Canadian historian Tim Travers framed part of his 1987 book, The Killing Ground, as a response to Terraine's work. But often it was very positive in getting scholars started in the first place. I undertook a small and decidedly unscientific straw poll of modern academic military historians, and it was surprising how many of them referred to his books as, to quote one of my correspondents, a very seminal early influence. So it wasn't just me. Terraine was also influential at a directly personal level. Although he could appear prickly, there were in fact many examples of his kindness to young historians. One, who went to see him, having been primed to expect an argumentative ogre, had found a man who was extremely kind, moderate, and informative. His leading and very active role of the president of the Western Front Association, an organisation with now about 6,000 members and 40-odd branches, further spread his influence through lectures, seminars, and battlefield tours. Now, this is actually a subject I think worthy of much deeper examination. What would the state of First World War scholarship, let alone reception of First World War in the wider public, be like if someone like John Laffin of British Bunglers and Butchers fame had become president of WFA rather than John Terraine? And from, I think, the mid-1970s onwards, Terraine's work on the First World War increasingly took its place in the academic mainstream. He also, I should say, wrote on a lot of other things, particularly on air power. That's not something I'm going to discuss tonight, but he has a reputation in some other fields of history as well. Well, he was so much part of the mainstream that by 1990, we find Terraine writing to his literary agent saying that he was involved in a time-consuming and ill-rewarded web of seminars. Well, Terraine seems to have cultivated a sort of Meldrewish image as a curmudgeon. It's sometimes said I'm becoming an old fuddy-duddy, he wrote at the age of 40 in 1961, before going on, somewhat unconvincingly, to deny it. It was perhaps in response to the barrage of criticism, some highly personal, that he received. John Terraine was not short on resilience and moral courage. He was sensitive to hostile reviews and personal criticism. In short, he was a man who bruised easily. And yet he was driven. At various times, and in some cases not without reason, it was suggested that Terraine was guilty of repeating himself, rewriting the same book over and over again, that he suffered from obsession, that his criticism of the biography of Haig was emotionally driven and very exaggerated, and even that his defence of Haig was motivated by his need for a father figure. But in spite of this, Terraine continued his revisionist campaign, but it's not surprising that the relative moderation of the tone of early works such as Mons and even Douglas Haig was replaced in later years by an approach that was more trenchant and overtly polemical. An episode from 1981 illustrates his uneasy relationship with academic historians. Hugh Strawn accused Terraine of fighting old battles, while the historiographical debate, if, Strawn said, we put aside the popular media, had moved on. Terraine's response was that the notion that the interpretations to which he was opposed had been laid to rest did not square with my own constant experience. In fact, both men were right up to a point. Although Strawn exaggerated his point, the scholarly debate had indeed moved on. The years 1978 to 81, I think, can be seen as the beginning of a productive period in which views on the subject were transformed through patient, archivally based scholarship. But in the popular mind and in the media, the donkey's interpretation was more firmly entrenched than ever. The tone and arguments of books that appeared subsequently, such as Dennis Winter's Haig's Command, 1991, John Mosier's Myth of the Great War, 2001, not to mention the 1989 television series Blackadder Goes Forth, suggests Terraine was not fighting toothless tigers. A quick glance at what's going on now as we run up to the centenary would suggest that pretty much the same comments still apply. Well, Terraine rather uneasily straddled the divide between academic and popular history. He was, for example, often criticised for over-reliance on published sources and neglecting archival research. Over the years, he used what he described as his author's papers to contain letters, diary excerpts, and documents from other sources which I've gathered over a period of some 30 years. And going through these papers has been an absolutely fascinating process. In Douglas Haig, he made extensive use of Haig's papers, which contain some official and demi-official documents in addition to Haig's diaries and correspondence. But he also made frequent use of Robert Blake's 1952 published edition of Haig's diaries, which was inevitably selective, and made use of the later typewritten version, typed up by Haig after the war, in other words, or by Lady Haig, rather than the contemporary handwritten one. His papers also contain some other archival material, such as the cabinet papers held in the Public Records Office, as was, for The Road to Passchendaele, published in 1977, but he was not, primarily, a historian who worked at the archival coalface. But there's no doubt that Terraine's work would have been enriched by greater use of primary source material. But it's important to remember that from 1964 onwards, Terraine earned his living from his pen. Up to that point, he had worked for the BBC, and there's some slightly embarrassed letters that he had to write to various generals and people inviting up to lunch saying, well, actually, I can't go because I've got a day job before 1964. After 1964, he simply lacked time for the leisurely exploitation of archives. He was too busy writing to earn a living. His early work was also criticised for lack of scholarly apparatus, but he seems to have taken his criticism on board, and his later books make full use of source notes. Those for The Right of the Line, his book about the Royal Air Force in the Second World War, published in 1985, are very full indeed. Well, heavy reliance on published sources, of course, had its perils. A long-running battle began over whether the fact that soldiers on 1st July 1916 were carrying 60-pound packs of equipment contributed to the disaster on that day. Terraine accused Sir James Edmonds, the official historian, of creating a myth that Little Hart was later to expand, supporting his argument by references from published sources about other groups of soldiers, such as the Chindits in Burma in the Second World War, similarly wearing heavy kit. Several serving soldiers took issue with this, including the then Colonel, now Lieutenant General Sir Hugh Pike, who had commanded 3 para in the Falklands in the previous year. Consensus was that Terraine had confused carrying heavy kit on the march with fighting so encumbered. Richard Holmes concluded that the artillery conquers, infantry occupies mentality led high command to make a false assumption as to what the infantry would have to do on reaching the enemy's trenches, to occupy, not to capture, and therefore the foot sloggers were equipped accordingly with barbed wire and spare sandbags and so on and so forth. Terraine kept plugging away, and reading the correspondence today in the British Army Review, honours are about even. The key point was High Command's mistaken view of the effectiveness of artillery, and Terraine and Holmes were in agreement about this. Richard was actually quite a fan of John Terraine in many ways. The wider point, however, is that subsequent archival research has shown that not all soldiers attacked on the 1st of July wearing heavy kit, or indeed at a slow walk. And by so arguing about a passage in the official history and using frankly spurious supporting evidence, Terraine demonstrated the weakness of his approach. Hours spent in the PRO, the National Archives, going through war diaries would have been far more productive. It's difficult to disagree with Richard Holmes' letter to the British Army Review. John Terraine has done probably more than anyone else to restore the reputations of First World War British commanders and their staff. There are, alas, times when I fear that in the process he's allowed the smoke of battle to dim the clarity of his vision. But Terraine's work did not only provoke criticism. Colonel R.C. Harris wrote to him in 1963, "Ever since I read your book on Mons, I have been looking forward to another from your pen and was lucky enough to secure a copy of Douglas Haig on the day of publication. I must write to you to express a feeling of gratitude which I am sure must be shared by many officers of my generation for your masterly appreciation of our old Commander-in-Chief." Brigadier R.H. Towle, who as a young man had commanded a battery in 34th Division on the Somme, approved of Douglas Haig, the educated soldier. It would have been, he wrote to Terraine 1965, a comfort to those who did not come back. It certainly seemed to be a comfort to this old soldier. Terraine had made sense of his war, arguing against what had become the dominant narrative of futility, instead returning it to the way it had been widely seen between 1940 and 1918. A terrible job that caused heavy casualties, but which had to be done, a triumph for the British Army that ultimately delivered victory. Terraine's insistence that they were wrong, that the war was not a pointless waste of lives, was a powerful counterblast to the instant historians. Not surprisingly, other veterans of the Great War, such as Charles Carrington and James Jack, approved of his work. And one letter I found going through Terraine's papers was from Ernest Gold, First Army's meteorologist in 1915. He wrote, basically, interested in your piece about the decision to release gas at Luce. It wasn't quite like that. I said to General Haig, ... Priceless piece of evidence. Well, where does Terraine's work on the First World War stand today? I think we need to differentiate between the Terraine thesis, there was no shortcut to victory, attrition was inevitable, and his views on Douglas Haig. On the first, I think his place is secure. Any serious historian of the Western Front has to engage with his arguments. Alex Danchev's words, written in 1991, long after the initial shock of Terraine's theses had died away, represent a mature reflection on Terraine's significance as a historian. Terraine's viewpoint, stripped of its rhetorical excess and forfeit of its emotional charge, served to reorient the historian's mental map of the war. 12 years later, Hugh Strawn conveyed a similar sentiment. Few historians now would accept Terraine in his entirety, but he undoubtedly set an agenda which has influenced a whole generation of writers. For example, this sentence written by Terraine: "The First World War was a war of coalitions and is not to be understood in any other way." It could have been written by any number of recent academic historians, Elizabeth Greenhalgh or Bill Philpott, for example. And as both Elizabeth and Bill have shown, that attacking Anglo-centric perspectives on the war has been a theme of some very important writing over the past few years. Within the last few years, Paul Harris has written that although not everybody liked the manner of his discourse, on the British way of warfare debate, Terraine essentially won the argument. Practically all First World War scholars of real substance are Westerners now. On Haig, the picture is more mixed. Without a doubt, he did an enormous service in rescuing Haig's reputation. Terraine restored Haig to the position of a serious commander rather than a pantomime villain to be sort of booed and hissed at. His 1963 biography, though inevitably dated, is still, in my view, required reading. But Haig remains a divisive figure. Scholars that could be grouped as the broadly anti-Haig camp include Paul Harris, Ian Beckett, and the Australian team of Robin Pryor and Trevor Wilson. In the opposite camp are to be found yours truly, Brian Bond, Andy Weist, Steve Badsey, Peter Simpkins, and John Bourne. But even the pro-Haig school generally have a couple of criticisms of Terraine's picture of the British Commander-in-Chief between 1915 and 1918. Firstly, he followed Haig too closely in arguing in Haig's, as Haig did in his final dispatch, written and published in 1919, a very skillfully crafted defence of his tenure as Commander-in-Chief. Terraine followed him too closely in arguing that the so-called wearing out battles of 1915 to 18 made the victory of 1918, the 100 days, possible. To a very large degree, actually, I think he was right, but in 1916 and 1917, Haig expected the operations to be of a much more decisive character. Actually, it strikes me that Haig sensibly had a plan A and a plan B for the Somme, for 30. If you broke through, great. If you didn't, it's more attrition. Secondly, so the final dispatch, and indeed Haig's thesis, smacks rather too much of ex post facto rationalisation. Secondly, Haig is, so I've done it again. Secondly, Terraine is simply just too deterministic on occasions. The subtitle of his Road to Passchendaele, A Study in Inevitability, makes one a little queasy. Third, I think Terraine overreacted to the accusations that Haig was a military dunce. Few recent historians, no matter how pro-Haig they might be, would fully subscribe to Terraine's claim that Haig was a great captain. It's possible that for once, Terraine was simply asking the wrong questions. In my recent book, I try to stress that Haig's task was hugely complex, far more complex than, for example, Marlborough, another great captain. Given the size of his army, the nature of his job, and the type of warfare on the Western Front, that made Haig, above all, a war manager, rather than simply a field commander. He had to deal with training, logistics, dealing with the government, dealing with the Allies, and all the rest of it. And Terraine simply did not give this element of Haig's command, this critical element of Haig's command, the attention it deserved. Terraine quite rightly identified coping with coalition warfare as an enduring theme in British generalship down the centuries, but otherwise, matching Haig against one of his predecessors from the 18th century was not really comparing like with like. Perhaps declaring Haig to be a great captain has got in the way of assessing Haig's true significance and, I would argue, achievement. Strangely, Terraine had a blind spot about one area where Haig did deserve some praise. Recently, the role of cavalry on the Western Front has undergone significant reappraisal. David Kenyon, who along with Steve Badsey has done some excellent work on British cavalry, has pointed out that Terraine showed a marked degree of ambivalence about Haig's cavalry background. Haig, of course, was 7th Hussars followed by 17th Lancers. Moreover, Terraine quotes Edmund's view that machine guns rendered cavalry action impossible as if it were a substantial fact, and then proceeded to build upon it in more than one book for the complete ineffectiveness of horse soldiers on the battlefield. Actually, as recent historians have shown, this is simply not true. That even under the conditions of trench warfare on the Western Front, cavalry on occasions had its place and could be quite effective. John Terraine, who made a career out of dispelling myths, was quite simply taken in by this one. I suspect the reason is not difficult to find. Terraine, eager to depict Haig as a modern commander, was embarrassed by his hero's enthusiasm for cavalry, which seemed so 19th century. Well, actually, my own work has built on the work of the likes of Kenyon and Badsey in rehabilitating Haig as a cavalry general. His operational concepts, which involved all arms groups, including cavalry, for cavalry, just read mobile troops, both have a modern feel and reach back to pre-war cavalry doctrine, in which Haig had a fair hand in designing. Arguably, John Terraine's most important role as a historian was to ask awkward questions and to carry on asking them over a period of 3 decades. Since many of the historians who from the late 1960s onwards have exploited the archives have, in Peter Simpkins' words, reached roughly the same general position as he had long occupied, it would appear that John Terraine was blessed with a rare combination of instinctive historical insight, intellectual integrity, and profound common sense. In reviewing a non-Western Front book, Business in Great Waters, the U-Boat Wars 1645, a leading naval historian, Professor Andrew Lambert, declared that Terraine has offered an example of that which is best in popular history, well written, well informed, and offering an opening for further study. I would suggest that the same could be said about his work on Haig, and more generally his work on the First World War. To have almost single-handedly recast the way that we think about the British Army on the Western Front, and to a lesser degree, but to a significant degree, have influenced the academic debate on the generalship of Douglas Haig, actually are 2 really significant achievements. John Terraine, in my view, is quite simply one of the most significant British military historians of the 20th century. And his work continues to be of relevance, continues to be built upon by subsequent generations of historians. And I suspect that we are going to hear a number of echoes of his ideas, both Terraine's own ideas and the ideas that he was attacking in spades over the next 5 years. Thank you very much indeed.